Hello, this is my first part of the talk of living things. We are starting biology today in Natural Science 102 for Danville Community College students. And so we're constantly in pursuit of life on different planets, and we don't really know how to define life in terms of what could be out there. But biology is the study of life that we know it on Earth, okay? And there's 5 characteristics of living things. Now, biology is, broadly speaking, the study of living things, okay? So a virologist who studies viruses, like maybe the COVID virus, is technically speaking not a biologist, because viruses do not have all of the common characteristics that we all have agreed are necessary to call something living, okay? They have some properties of living things, but not all. So viruses are not living. The study of biology draws on chemistry and physics, which we've both covered in the class, for its foundation, and applies these principles to the study of processes of life, all right? Now, living things have abilities and structures that are typically not found in non-living objects like a rock or a mountain or a cup of water or something like that, okay? And there are 5 characteristics generally agreed that non-living things do not have. Metabolic processes, that's basically how, well, we'll get into it. The second thing, I'll just list them out here. Generative processes. The third thing is control processes. The fourth thing is responsive properties. Actually, that was the fourth, but doesn't matter. There's 5 things here. And the 5th thing is order, or a unique structural organization. Okay, so let's go through some of these things and illustrate them with diagrams and so on and so forth, okay? So let me show you an image here. This is from the OpenStax textbook on biology. What we have here is a frog, okay? And this has very particular order, all right? If you were to look at that, you would see that, wow, something had to make that. You know, there were cells that had to reproduce and organize in a certain way and make this thing. It doesn't look just like, you know, it has structure, it has order to it, okay? Now, organisms, I'll read this a little bit in case you can't see this. Organisms are, and that means living things, right? So organisms are highly organized, coordinated structures that consist of one or more cells, okay? Even very simple one-celled organisms are remarkably complex, and we'll talk about what's inside the cell in a bit. But inside each cell, there are atoms that comprise molecules, and these molecules in turn comprise and make up cell organelles, bigger parts within the cell, and other cellular inclusions. In multicellular organisms, similar cells group together to form tissues, okay? Tissues in turn collaborate to create body organs, all right? And these are bigger structures, and organs work together to form an organ system, like the digestive system is comprised of the stomach, the intestines, some other things, okay? So there's a hierarchical ordering there, okay? First you have atoms and molecules. Maybe there's larger molecules called proteins or DNA that form complexes that build up a cell membrane. Cell membranes are part of cell walls. Cell walls are part of cells. Cells are part of tissues. Tissues are part of organs. Organs are part of organ systems, and an organ system is basically part of an organism or a living creature, okay? Let me write these things down on the board in case you want to see the hierarchy there, okay? So once again, we're talking about structural similarities between living things. All living things are organized into complex structural units called cells, okay? And then all living things are organized into complex structural, more complicated things. There's membranes, and there's organs and tissues and everything else, okay? So I'll just put the chart up here so we can see what that looks like. So we've got atoms, and these are fundamental units of matter. As far as I'm aware, nobody calls atoms living or have a consciousness or anything like that. Molecules are a specific arrangement of atoms. And I'll give you an example here. Water is the simplest molecule, but water is deemed essential for all life here on planet Earth. Okay. Proteins, sugars, lipids, and genetic material, DNA, are all examples of molecules. DNA is very large, so are proteins. Sugars and lipids are a little bit smaller, but they self-assemble into larger things called cells. A cell is the fundamental unit of a biological living thing. There are unicellular organisms that are comprised of one cell, okay? And then there are other things called multicellular organisms like us that are comprised of many different cells, okay? So a cell is the smallest unit that displays the characteristics of life. And this is what I was alluding to. So when NASA looks outside of the solar system at different stars, exoplanets, they're looking for the presence of water. Water is, a solvent we've talked about that supports many of the living processes, the metabolic processes that we'll talk about here in a bit. And so when they find water, a presence of water on a comet or a moon or an asteroid or something, they get excited. They think, oh, there might have been the existence for that life there, okay? So when they found water, evidence of water on Mars, a lot of people got really excited about that because they thought, well, if there was water on Mars in the past that was flowing, maybe there could have been life at one point on Mars, okay? The way we look for life is to look for cells, presumably made by DNA, maybe other materials, okay? So anyways, here on Earth, we are looking for cells, okay? So extraterrestrial life might not be made of similar types of molecules, okay? But they're going to be made from the same types of atoms that we are made from, because atoms are everywhere in the universe, the 118 atoms of the periodic table, okay? All right, so the cell here on planet Earth is the smallest unit of living things, okay? And a cell can form tissue. Okay. Tissue is a group of cells that perform particular functions. All right. And then you have an organ. An organ can be groups of different types of tissues, but It's basically a larger grouping that performs particular functions, okay? It's a group of tissues that perform a particular function. Generally speaking, we're going larger, right? Atoms very small, molecules bigger, cells, you still can't see them without a microscope. Tissues, you can see a tissue, you can see an organ. And go on from here, then you'll have an organ system. An organ system is a group of organs, right, that perform particular functions. Okay. Sometimes we call these systems. So a digestive system, for example, is comprised of many different parts, right? The nervous system is comprised of different parts. So these are examples of organ systems. So nervous system. The nervous system doesn't just make you nervous. It is what's there to help you perceive the senses, right? So your eyes, if you just think about your eyes, there's a whole bunch of stuff in there, muscles and optics and lenses and so on and so forth, and fluid to focus light onto your optic nerve. And then that's transmits signals to your brain, and then your brain processes this and perceives reality in the way it does, okay, as colors. The nervous system, so that might be the vision system, for example, okay? Yeah, so that's ordering, okay? And you're getting more complex on the bottom. Less complex at the top. So when scientists go and chop a rock in half and then they see a shell, a fossil of a shell in there, they're basically looking at the exoskeleton of the animal, but it infers that there was tissue inside of that at some point that was comprised of cells, and sometimes we can extract DNA or look at different ratios of nitrogen and carbon to figure out, you know, different things about this animal. Was it living in freshwater, seawater, or what, okay? So that right there is discussing the order. Here I called it unique structure, but here in very easy language, I'm just calling it the order, okay? So we've talked a little bit about that, okay? The other thing we want to talk about is, let's look at my open stacks here. Let me get a new slide. I think the next thing we want to talk about is responsiveness. So all living things are sensitive or responsive to stimulus, all right? If I shine a bright light on an animal, they'll usually close their eyes, okay? We can flinch. If there's super hot heat that we're sensing because of a fire, we'll run away from that. If there's a loud noise, we have the fight or flight, you know, adrenaline response that goes on in our body. But even plants, okay, are responsive. So these are the leaves of a sensitive plant called the Mimosa pudica, I don't know how to pronounce that. And it kind of looks like a fern, okay? And when you touch its leaves, they will instantly droop and fold. But then after a few minutes, they will return back to their normal shape. So that's rather interesting. You might wonder, well, why does this plant respond in this way? Is it to scare an animal away that's not familiar with this plant? So if they tried to bite it, it moves and the animal gets spooked and runs off? Or is it some other way to prevent an animal from eating its leaves? There might be some kind of reason for this design. Now, Organisms respond to many different kinds of stimuli, okay? Stimuli is plural for stimulus. For example, plants can bend towards a source of light. You may have noticed this if you have a flower or a plant in your house. It always seems to be growing towards the window, which is where the sunlight is, okay? Plants can also climb up fences. That is responding to the outside environment. They can respond to touch, as I mentioned, and even tiny bacteria can move away or toward various chemicals, a process called chemotaxis. Okay, so if you look at a petri dish of bacteria that are moving, they can actually move towards or away different chemicals. Okay, if it's sugar or something beneficial to eat, it might move towards it. If it's some other chemical that indicates that there's a lot of bacteria there producing a lot of waste, it might move away from that. Okay. Movement towards a stimulus is a positive response. Movement away from a stimulus is negative response. And you might wonder, well, how do bacteria move? What is that? Well, here's a little figure showing a bacteria, and this little tail coming off the end is called a flagella or flagellum. And this is there's a lot of mechanics there of this protein and how it's able to flop basically, and so it can rapidly move and propel itself through a fluid. Okay, so these are mobile bacteria. Okay, normally you wouldn't think of plants as being mobile, but they grow. They move towards sunlight. They climb up vines and so on and so forth. Okay, so let's write a little bit of that down. Okay, responsive to environment. Okay. Give some examples. A deer is scared by a loud noise. I have deer on my property and I don't seem to see them being very scared. But if you make a very loud noise or you run towards them or something, they will respond, they will run away. Okay? Plants grow towards sunlight. Or up vines. Okay, they grow up, well, they grow up fences if they are vines. I'll just say that. We have a lot of ivy here that grows up trees, and it tends to grow up the tree, right? Presumably there's more sunlight at the top of the tree, and they're responding to sunlight, okay? Plants grow towards the sunlight, and they grow up fences, okay? Another thing, what did we say? Bacteria, plants. Okay, so that's good. Let's leave it at that, okay? So we've talked about, let's mark that off our list. We talked about responsiveness. I'm sorry it's not in the exact order I'm talking here, but all living things are going to be responsive, okay? If NASA finds this thing that they think is alive right now, and they poke it or touch it or put electricity on it, or they shine light on it, or they make a loud noise, or they pour sugar on next to it or something like that, and it doesn't move or respond at all, one would have to conclude, well, that thing is not living, right? And you've seen a lot of science fiction movies where there's a lot of suspense. An object is found or a thing is found, and then they're trying to figure out what it is and so on, and the movie becomes very interesting when it starts responding, right, and killing humans and causing like destruction, and then the movie starts, right? So that is a major requirement for living things, okay? What else is a requirement for living things? Let's grab our text here. Reproduction, okay? Reproduction is called generative processes, okay? They basically grow, they get bigger, and they make additional copies of themselves in different ways, okay? Single-celled organisms reproduce by first duplicating their DNA. It divides into equal parts, and then you have cells that repair and divide into two new cells that are exact copies of one another, okay? Whereas multicellular organisms are a little bit different. They often produce specialized productive cells called gametes, oocytes, sperm cells. So after fertilization, fusion, and so on, there's a new individual that develops a new individual cell or a new individual cell, and then that can divide and grow into other things, okay? Now, in all types of reproduction, DNA contains the genes, and that's passed on to the offspring, okay? And these genes ensure that the offspring will belong to the same species. So a human is not going to give birth to a cat's not going to give birth to a dog, right? So this is one thing that controls the reproduction, okay? So let's take a look. There's a nice little cute picture here. We all see the mommy cat here and the litter of kittens. And basically, no two of these kittens look alike, but these kittens have inherited genes from both of the parents, okay? So they share many characteristics. They have a tail, they have fur, and so on, okay? These are cats. Okay? So we call that generative process or reproduction. And it all still starts at the cellular level, okay? So a single cell contains DNA. DNA is called genetic material. It's the blueprint or building instructions for what that creature is going to look like, okay? You've seen Jurassic Park where they have some amber. They extract the DNA from that, and then they recreate the dinosaur that it used to be, okay? So whether it's T-Rex or Triceratops or Brontosaurus, whatever, all the different dinosaurs, it comes from the DNA. So everybody's DNA is different. Every species' DNA is going to be related a little bit, but it's going to be extremely distinct from a tree, okay? A tree and a bacteria and a human are going to have a very different DNA, all right? Some similarities, some, but not, is very different, okay? So this is the genetic instructions, genetic material, which is the blueprint for the cell and thus the tissues and organs and organism, okay? And so in unicellular processes, I'll just talk about that since it's simplest. Yeast, for example, are unicellular organisms. There's one big cell, okay? And then through a process, it divides into two equal parts. And it's actually a clone, so one yeast and the other yeast have exactly the same identical DNA if the process did not occur with any errors. And that's called unicellular reproduction, okay? So each of these cells are going to have DNA that describes all of the proteins and sugars and everything that's within it, okay? And how it responds and how it acts and everything else, okay? And so that's just an example of a yeast. This is a unicellular reproduction. All right, don't want to go into that too much, just to say all living things are going to reproduce. A tree has a way to create seeds, and those seeds fall on the ground, they get covered by little leaves or soil, and then they grow the next spring into another tree, right? So this is available for both plants and animals, broadly speaking. Not all of these reproduce by unicellular reproduction, okay? All right. What next? We have, let's look at our list here. Well, let me just bring the slide in. All right. We have, we talked about adaptation basically and responsiveness, homeostasis. So we've talked about responsiveness, metabolic processes. We haven't talked about metabolic processes, okay? Basically, I'll write this down on the board in a second, but metabolic processes are how an organism, a living creature, can move matter and energy or process matter and energy to keep it alive, okay? What is this? The California condor. It uses chemical energy to be able to fly, okay? So somehow it eats things, and that gives it energy, and it has energy now to flap its wings and fly, okay? All organisms use a source of energy for their metabolic processes. We'll talk about the food chain later. It's very important, but I don't like the word food chain because people think about material or just food or something like that, but it's actually an energy chain, okay? When this animal here, the California condor, eats a smaller animal, it gets not just food, but energy for it to do something with that, okay? And so how it processes and uses that energy is metabolism or metabolic processes, okay? Some organisms, like plants, capture the energy directly from the sun and convert that into chemical energy for food. So a potato grows and it produces starch, which is a stored up, it's a solar battery basically. It transforms solar energy into starch. The starch is stored in the potato, and then that can be eaten by you or me or a different animal, okay? And then that energy is passed on to them, okay? Other animals can't sit out in the sun and just absorb energy passively like a tree. They have to eat things, okay? And those are the more interesting animals in my opinion. Some animals eat only plants, some animals eat only meat, some animals eat both. So we'll talk more about that in the future, okay? But that's metabolism. So let me talk and write about that a little bit. So metabolic processes was the first thing on the list. Let's see if I can find that in here. Sorry. Oh, here it is. Metabolic processes. The easier word to discuss is metabolism. And metabolism here is defined basically as the, where was it? This book has a really nice succinct way of saying that. Oh, here it is. Metabolism are the chemical reactions required for a cell to grow. Maybe grow isn't the best word here. Because, you know, if you're an adult, you're not growing anymore, but there's cells dying and growing all the time within your body, okay? And reproduce and also make repairs, for example. So that in a nutshell is metabolism. So the chemical reactions. So basically food changes into energy, and that energy can be used to do something this slide, let's just list some of those. What will a plant do? A plant will grow. How can a plant reproduce? It produces an apple, and inside the apple is an apple seed, right? So they can make fruit, for example, if we're talking about a fruit tree. Okay. How can they make repairs? Well, I don't know much about plant science, so I'm not going to hazard a guess. How about animals? Animals, remember, again, are comprised of cells. So there are cells within each of our tissues that make up the organs that make up our body. So, you know, when we eat a hamburger, what are we going to do with that energy? We might go for a walk. We might clean up our room. We might just survive for the day, which requires us to have a certain energy level. Our hearts are beating, and there's blood flow and many different processes happening just automatically that we don't really need to push buttons to get them going. But we do need food, which gives us the energy to do that. Okay? So we'll talk a lot more about the food chain later on. I think that will tie in the relationship between food and energy very nicely. Okay? What else did we not talk about? I think we talked about 4 of the 5. Anyways, we talked about metabolic, regenerative processes. Well, one of them was controlled processes, and we'll talk more about food chains or food webs in the future. I'll just mention it briefly here. Control processes, you know, you can think of it individually within a single organism like us. So, for example, if we need to run for a long distance, we're going to feel hungry, and we're going to need to eat as a response for that. Okay. So when our muscles are working, then after a while we feel fatigue, right? Our body's telling us slow down, or take a break, or take a rest. Or we're feeling hungry. Our stomach is sending signals to our brain that indeed we need to consume some more stuff, all right? Or we start feeling the sensation of thirst. Our body is giving us hints or indication that we need to drink some water. So those are feedback mechanisms to tell us something, okay? Okay. For example, with thirst, your mouth is having a certain sensation that tells your brain that you're thirsty, and then your brain can process information and decide to drink, right? And then you'll have to use your muscles of your arm to put, liquid water, for example, into your mouth, okay? And we talked about fatigue, for example. In the food chains, there's a feedback on the ecosystem or biosystem, or your backyard, for example, okay? So let's say you have a bunch of worms that are coming up to the surface. Maybe it's raining, and that tends to draw the worms out, right? There's going to be more birds that come into your yard to eat a few of the worms that are easy picking, okay? And so the worm is part of that ecosystem, okay? And this is an example of ecosystem feedback, okay? The birds can decrease the population of worms in your yard, maybe if it's raining a lot, okay? So there's environmental factors that come into play. If you have a really wet year, that might affect your earthworm population in your backyard, and perhaps how well your vegetables grow that year. Or if it's a dry year, you might have less birds, right? Because there's less, nuts and seeds on the ground as well, because the trees aren't producing as much, and definitely the earthworms won't be up at the surface of a drought-stricken area. So this is an example of a feedback on a larger ecosystem. We will talk about ecosystems later when we talk about food chains and food webs later in the course. Okay? So those are the fundamental requirements for something to be living, okay? Another thing that we have is the cell is the fundamental underpinning of biology, okay? There's a lot of different parts of the cell, and I want to talk about that a little bit. We have the cell membrane. The cell membrane is composed of a lipid bilayer. It's called the fluid mosaic model. But basically, it's oil and water. And we kind of have, we draw it as a simplified model here. We don't draw the too much of the molecule, okay? But this represents a molecule, okay? So this is a lipid molecule. A lipid is a fat. It can be oil from peanut butter, it could be oil from olive oil, or it could be the white parts of red meat, okay, that you eat. That's an example of fat, okay? Now, lipids are composed of a polar head and something we call a nonpolar tail. Polar head is hydrophilic. That means it's water loving. I'll just say it likes water here. And the nonpolar tail is called hydrophobic. I don't know why I keep saying the wrong thing as I'm writing. So hydrophobic means you're afraid of water, right? Does not like water. So when you put a bunch of this material into water, it'll self-assemble into, a sphere with two membranes. It's called a bilayer, okay? So the lipid bilayer kind of looks like this. And I'll just draw a few of these components. So what I'm drawing here is the lipid bilayer. Bi means two. Think about bicycle or a biped or something like that. Bi means two. So there's one layer here, and then there's one layer here. Okay? Now remember, the blue guys here are polar. They like water. So water is going to be here, 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 here. And on the other side, here, here, and here, right? So that's why we have these two rings. You have extracellular, means outside. And we have the intracellular portion of the cell, which means on the inside. And those two rings that I've drawn there just represent the two lines, okay? So this is a small part of the lipid bilayer, but you can imagine that it's going to curve around and come back and form a perfect kind of bubble, okay? And this is three-dimensional. This is three-dimensional. It's not just a flat thing here, okay? And so we have maybe this top part is the extracellular part of the membrane. So that's water outside the cell, okay? And maybe this is the intracellular portion of the bilayer, and so the water molecules and the rest of the stuff is going to be on the inside of the cell, okay? So there's two sides to the membrane. There's outside the cell, extracellular. There's inside the cell, which is intracellular, okay? Now you have many different parts to the cell here, but the cell membrane is the major part of the cell, okay? It's very fatty in the middle. It's nonpolar, so things can't pass through the cell very easily. You have to have different mechanisms for food to come in and waste to go out, okay? So the other thing you have here is, let me just show a little figure. I'm sure the book here has something. Well, this is a little bit too large of a view here. Not sure if you can see this well in the video, but what do we have here? We have the cell membrane. It's in that dark green thing, okay? And it serves a purpose, okay? It separates the outside from the inside. Let me see if I can find a... Here's a size comparison. I'm not sure if you can see this in the video, but we've got atoms, which are very small. We have lipids, which are larger molecules. We have proteins, flu viruses, and then we have bacteria, mitochondria, maybe an animal cell. Okay, so these are smaller pieces that come together to form a larger cell. Let me see if I can see it in here. Okay, so here is a picture of a typical animal cell. Okay. And what I'm focusing on here is this outer ring. Let me see if I can zoom in this picture here. That's as big as it gets. Okay, so now this is a biology book only for biologists, so we don't need to write down all of these different names and try to memorize them, because this is not a biology course. I'm just giving a very brief overview, so please don't get concerned by this slide. What I do want to point out are a couple of features here, okay? In a very broad sense. So here is the lipid bilayer that goes around the whole cell. And you can see how it has two lines, okay? It has two lines because the lipids, they have the tails that kind of go together, and then the head groups, which might be my hands, form the two layers, okay? So this is the lipid bilayer, okay? The purpose of the cell membrane is to protect the inside of the cell, to make sure harmful chemicals don't come in, and it's a bag that holds everything together in a close proximity, so there's different functioning parts in there, okay? Inside the cell are organelles, okay, are parts to the cell that do particular functions, okay? It's like a big machine, and there's all these different parts, okay? You've got filaments, you've got things that are involved with motion, you've got lysozymes, which helps digest food and move food around in the cell. You have vacuoles and other kinds of things that hold material for a bit, that either for waste and so on. Here's a peroxisome, for example, which is metabolizing waste. This is a mitochondria, which produces energy. So many of the little parts within the cell help with the metabolic processes of the cell, okay? The cell membrane is there to protect it from outside influences and to hold everything in close proximity, okay? Let's talk about how things get into the cell and outside the cell. So your cell membrane, we've talked quite a bit about how it's made. Very specifically, the polar head group of lipids points towards the water, which are the blue little balls, and then the nonpolar tails point inside the membrane, okay? You need to know what's on this slide here, okay? So the lipid bilayer, or the cell membrane, holds things together. And it protects the cell. Of course, you don't want other cells thinking you're going to be food, so you want to have the lipid bilayer there to kind of create a barrier, okay, to prevent other things from coming in and messing you up, okay? Now, how does food get into the cell, and how does waste get out of the cell? So we might be talking about different types of cells. So a human cell, for example, we all know we need to breathe oxygen, and all our cells need to have oxygen. So oxygen needs to transport across the cell membrane, and that's just done by diffusion, okay? So this is a natural process by which gases or maybe a water molecule or something very small can pass through the cell membrane without anything having to guard it or anything, okay? So this is passive, it means it happens by itself, and this is a transport, and this is things across the cell membrane. Oxygen, carbon dioxide are two such gases that can transport relatively easy across the cell membrane, okay? So diffusion is the net movement just by random movement across the cell membrane, okay? And that's all I really want to talk about that. Now there's another way that well, it's going to be too complicated for us, so we're not going to talk about osmosis. Now we have facilitated diffusion or active transport. And it's not passive, it's active. So there are certain molecules on the surface of the cell that will grab onto, like, say, a sugar molecule or a protein, and it will bring it into the cell, okay? And this process is called endocytosis. Okay? Key term there. So this is how larger molecules and things can be brought into the cell. Okay. So these are carriers or transporters. Okay. We have things called drug transporters. They're actually proteins on the surface of a cell membrane that recognize a drug, grab it, pull it in, or sometimes they push it out of the cell. Okay. There's lots of different diagrams and things like that. I don't think I'll spend time to do that. Okay. So these are usually membrane spanning proteins with channels. So you can think of this as like, whoops, that didn't work out well. So pretend like we have the lipid bilayer here. Okay. And we had a cell down here that needed potassium ions. So we rush out, we eat a banana, and we get potassium ions in our system. And And we'll just say that these are little circles, okay? So these circles represent potassium ions. Okay. Now, potassium ions are water-loving. They're surrounded by water. They're soluble in water, so there's no way for it to go through that greasy barrier of the cell membrane. So what it needs is a ion channel. So this is an example of a transporter that's designed to transport certain ions and only in one direction. These are going to have the right charge and shape to go into this tube here, and then they get transported from the outside of the cell into the cell, for example. Okay? So an ion channel is designed to bring ions, sodium, potassium, calcium are some of the common ones I can think of, across the cell membrane. And there's like 7 or 8 different classes of transporters, I'm sure, that could easily be discussed one after another. But if you understand this, I think it's fine. Think of that as a toilet paper tube with a channel in the middle. And so a certain size ball could go through there. I think maybe a ping pong ball could fit inside a toilet paper tube, but not a baseball, because a baseball is too big, right? So that's basically how one way in which it can select and allow only certain molecules or ions to go through the channel, okay? All right. So that's an example of an active transporter. We have things, by the way, in your bodies that are called proton pumps. A proton is H+, in case you were wondering, but this creates acidity in your stomach. And so it produces acidity in your stomach by transferring protons through that different cells that line your stomach lining. Okay, so it's a method that's not just hypothetical. It's, you know, why would you want to have acid in your stomach? Well, maybe you're about to eat something, or maybe your food is being digested by your stomach, so you need to produce acidity to help with that digestion. Okay, so this is a type of active transport. All right. Now, one thing that's very important are various organelles, okay? And there's a whole bunch of different organelles, okay? Organelles are smaller parts of the cell. Process waste. They produce energy. They're involved with reproduction. Just to name a few. Now, I'm not going to run through all of the different types of organelles and what they're there for. Oh, we should probably mention one major one, and that's to provide structure. Plant cells, in particular, have a very rigid cell wall, and the rigidity helps a plant, for example, stand upright and not be just so floppy and noodly, okay? We have bones on the inside of our body to help us stand upright. If we didn't have bones, we would be kind of like more like a jello flopping around on the ground. Okay, so there's a lot of this different stuff, and it's extremely complex. But the organelles are on that kind of that other figure I showed you before. You don't need to memorize the names of them, but just be aware of 4 of the many different functions or jobs that they have, okay? They process waste. Why would you want to do that? Well, after you generate energy and you do something, you're going to have waste. We all know as humans we have waste. Okay, waste could be as simple as a breath of air, carbon dioxide, or it could be other materials, the byproducts of metabolism. Okay, byproducts of metabolism. CO2, for example, maybe oxygen. Okay, they're used to produce energy. These are the power plants. Our cells work in consort. So, for example, muscle cells, they all work together for us to have energy to, extend or contract our arms. Okay, and there's a lot of physics and biology behind that. But basically, each cell needs to have a certain amount of energy that's expending at that moment. And so, on demand, when you're deciding, hey, I need to lift up that heavy box, within seconds, milliseconds, your cells can pretty much on demand instantly provide that energy. So it's done by these, they're called mitochondria, but you don't need to memorize the name, but those are the power plants in cells, okay? Reproduction is very important for cells because we want to prevent mistakes from happening, genetic abnormalities, mutations, things like this that would make somebody grow, a third arm, right? And that wouldn't be as functional as maybe having two, as far as we know. So this is very carefully controlled in the nucleus of the cell, where your DNA is located. So I would like you to memorize this phrase, deoxyribonucleic acid, which we just write DNA, but that's DNA. So know that DNA is the blueprint for the genetic material that will make a copy of the cell, okay? So that's done in the nucleus. And it provides structure. As we talked about plants need to be rigid. Bones, for example. Okay. All right. I believe that's about what I wanted to talk about. There's a bunch of stuff in the nucleus of a cell, many different parts and pieces, but just memorize DNA. That's the most important part here for my very simple overview class, okay? Now we have different types of cells. There's only two that I really want to talk about, okay? We have prokaryotic cell structure. Prokaryotic cells are from bacteria and archaea, and they don't have a nucleus bound to a nuclear membrane, okay? They don't have mitochondria, chloroplast, Golgi, or extensive networks of endoplasmic reticulum. So they're like simpler cells, okay? But some eukaryotic cells are simple too, so I can't really make that generalization, okay? So for us, for our purposes, just think about this as a simpler cell because there's less components, okay? And they're normally found in bacteria and this word here, archaea, which means basically in between, it's like, we didn't have this, I'll talk more about this later when we talk about the classification of living things, but this is kind of like in a mystery category. It's not quite a bacteria, it's not quite an animal, it's not quite a plant, but sometimes they have features that are like mixed. Okay, so it's a weird category. So these are your prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are contain a nucleus. Most of the membrane organelles that we described earlier, and they can be subdivided into different things like plants, fungi, protozoa, algae. Animals, for example, are eukaryotic. Okay? And I'll call fungi a plant here if you don't mind. So just remember that it's a more complicated cell that's found in animals and plants. Okay. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say there. So I believe that's it for today's lecture. We've talked about living things, the 5 requirements, what some of those things are. We've talked about the lipid bilayer. We've talked about cells in great detail today, how there's a hydrophobic tail and a hydrophilic head group that causes lipids to self-assemble into lipid bilayers. There are certain modes of transport across the cell membrane. We have diffusion and active transport. We've talked about basically that there are these things called organelles, or smaller parts within the cell, that are responsible for several different things: disposing of waste, producing energy, reproduction, providing rigidity. And we've talked about the 2 types of cells. All bacteria cells are prokaryotic, as we showed, and some archaeas. These are simpler cells, okay? And eukaryotic cells are more complicated, and those are found in animals and plants. That's it for today's lecture. Hope you enjoyed watching and learning a little bit about cells. Please like and give us a thumbs up if you found this video useful. Have a great day.